Hello, and welcome back to the Whispered Lore. Find a comfortable position and let your breathing soften. Tonight, our journey takes us to the sun-warmed shores of ancient Egypt and into the quiet, hallowed halls of the great Library of Alexandria. We will not be exploring grand philosophies or epic histories, but something far more fundamental, more rhythmic. We will witness the gentle, meticulous work that sustained this beacon of knowledge, the administration of its vast papyrus collection. Settle in as we explore the quiet dedication of the scribes and the steady, methodical process of cataloging the world's wisdom. There is nothing for you to do but rest and listen as we gently unfurl the scribe's scroll. In the quiet currents of history, there are ideas so vast they resemble not a single thought, but an intellectual climate. One such idea, which arose from the fertile silt of the Nile Delta in the wake of Alexander's conquests, was the dream of universal knowledge. It was a dream of containment, of gathering every thought, every story, every discovery of humankind into a single, consecrated place. This is the story of that place, the great Library of Alexandria, and more specifically, the story of the quiet, methodical labor that gave its dream substance, the administration of its papyrus scrolls, and the monumental effort to catalog all that was known. Our journey begins not with a building, but with a city, Alexandria, founded by the Macedonian king in 331 BCE, was conceived as a nexus. It was to be a bridge between the Hellenic world and the ancient wisdom of Egypt, a cosmopolitan hub on the Mediterranean coast. After Alexander's death, his general, Ptolemy I Soter, took control of Egypt and established a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. Ptolemy was more than a soldier. He had been a companion of Alexander and, through him, was intellectually descended from Aristotle. He understood that power was not merely a matter of armies and territory, but of culture and intellect. To make Alexandria the preeminent city of the known world, it needed to be its undisputed intellectual capital. The instrument of this ambition was the Mouseion, the Shrine of the Muses. This was not simply a temple, but a research institution, a proto-university modeled on Aristotle's Lyceum in Athens. It was a complex of buildings featuring lecture halls, covered walkways or peripetoi for scholarly perambulation, dining commons, botanical gardens, and even a zoological collection. Scholars from across the Hellenic world and beyond were invited to live and work there, supported by a generous royal stipend, free from the mundane concerns of daily life, tasked only with the pursuit of knowledge. At the heart of the Mouseion, its lifeblood and its purpose, was the library, or, more accurately, the libraries. There was the main library, situated within the palace grounds in the Brucheion, the royal quarter, and a later smaller daughter library located at the Serapeum, the temple of the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. Together, they were to house a copy of every scroll in existence. This was not a passive accumulation. The Ptolemies enacted a policy of acquisition that was unprecedented in its scope and aggression. Royal agents were dispatched to the great book markets of Rhodes and Athens, armed with vast sums of gold to purchase any and all available texts. But the most famous policy was one of forcible acquisition. A decree was issued that any ship docking in the bustling harbor of Alexandria was to be searched for books. Any scrolls discovered were confiscated and brought to the library. There, scribes would meticulously create a copy. The newly made copy was then returned to the owner, while the original manuscript was kept for the library's collection, carefully labeled, "From the ships." A notable instance of this policy's ambition concerns the official state copies of the plays of the great Athenian tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Ptolemy III Euergetes requested to borrow these precious master copies from Athens for the purpose of transcription. The Athenian government, hesitant to let such treasures leave their city, demanded a colossal security deposit of 15 silver talents, an immense fortune. Ptolemy agreed, paid the deposit, and the scrolls were sent to Alexandria. There, the finest scribes created beautiful new copies on the highest quality papyrus. It was these copies that were sent back to Athens. Ptolemy willingly forfeited his 15 talents of silver, preferring to keep the original, authoritative texts for his collection. This relentless drive to collect created a logistical challenge of immense proportions. The world that emerged from the shadow of Alexander the Great was one of fractured ambition. His generals, the Diadochi, carved the conquered lands into personal kingdoms, each vying for the mantle of his legacy. In the fertile and ancient land of Egypt, Ptolemy, son of Lagos, a shrewd and calculating commander, established a dynasty that would endure for 3 centuries. His new capital, Alexandria, rising from a strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean Sea, was designed to be more than a center of commerce or military power. It was to be the intellectual heartbeat of the entire Hellenistic world. This ambition, grand in its scope and meticulous in its conception, would give rise to the Great Library, and at its core, the Mauseon, the Shrine of the Muses. The Ptolemaic vision was not merely to collect books, but to systematically acquire, organize, and institutionalize the accumulated knowledge of all peoples, forging a city of learning unprecedented in human history. The genesis of this monumental project can be traced to the influence of one man, Demetrius of Phaleron. An Athenian statesman, orator, and a student of Theophrastus in Aristotle's Peripatetic school, Demetrius found himself exiled from Athens and sought refuge at the court of Ptolemy I Soter around the year 297 BCE. He brought with him the intellectual framework of the Athenian Lyceum, an institution dedicated not just to teaching, but to collaborative research and the systematic collection of texts. He proposed to Ptolemy a project of breathtaking scale, the creation of a universal library that would contain copies of every book in the known world, and an associated research institute, the Mauseon, to house the world's greatest minds. This was a vision that appealed directly to Ptolemy's desire for cultural prestige. To control knowledge was to control the narrative of civilization itself, positioning Alexandria as the true successor to Athens. The Mauseon and the library were inextricably linked, a symbiotic pairing of scholarship and resource. The Mauseon was not a museum in the modern sense, but a state-funded institution of higher learning and research. Its members, or fellows, were scholars, poets, scientists, and philosophers drawn from across the Hellenistic world. They were provided with generous state stipends, exemption from taxes, free lodging, and communal dining facilities. Their sole obligation was to pursue their studies. This environment, free from the daily concerns of subsistence, was designed to foster pure intellectual inquiry. The institution was organized with a priest appointed by the king as its head, but its intellectual direction was guided by the senior scholars. It featured long, covered walkways, or peripatoi, for walking and discussion, echoing the tradition of Aristotle's own school. There were lecture halls, anatomical dissection rooms, astronomical observatories, and botanical gardens. It was a complete ecosystem for the intellectual elite. Adjacent to this scholarly sanctuary, and serving as its indispensable heart, was the Great Library, the Bibliothèque. It was likely housed in a series of buildings within the Royal Palace complex, in the Brucheion district of the city. The physical structure was designed for the preservation and use of its fragile contents. The scrolls were stored in specially constructed racks, or pigeonholes, known as armaria, lining the walls of large halls. The architecture would have prioritized indirect light to prevent the fading of ink, and sufficient ventilation to combat the humidity that was a constant threat to papyrus. The scale of the collection grew with astonishing speed, fueled by the immense wealth of the Ptolemaic kingdom, and a series of aggressive, state-mandated acquisition policies. The primary method of acquisition was systematic and uncompromising. We begin not with the word, nor with the thought it represents, but with the vessel that carries them through time. The lifeblood of knowledge in the Hellenistic world, the very substrate upon which the intellectual legacy of antiquity was inscribed, was the papyrus scroll. To understand the monumental task of the librarians and scribes of Alexandria, one must first understand the physical medium they handled each day. It was not a passive container, but an active participant in the preservation and transmission of ideas, with its own inherent qualities, vulnerabilities, and demands. The journey of the scroll begins in the marshy wetlands of the Nile Delta, a landscape of fertile black silt and shimmering water. Here grows the progenitor plant, Cypress papyrus, a tall, robust sedge that thrived in the shallow, slow-moving, fresh water. Its form was distinctive, a thick, triangular stalk or culm rising from a submerged rhizome system capable of reaching heights of up to 5 meters. At its apex, the culm blossoms into a dense umbel of long, thread-like stems, a feathery crown that would sway in the gentle Egyptian breeze. This plant was not merely a raw material. It was a symbol of the life-giving Nile itself, deeply interwoven with the culture and economy of the region. The harvest was a methodical, seasonal affair. Workers would wade into the dense papyrus thickets, selecting mature stalks of appropriate thickness. Using sharp, curved knives, they would sever the culms near their base, just above the rhizome. The prized portion of the plant was the lower part of the stalk, where the triangular stem was at its widest and contained the most pith. The upper, thinner sections and the feathery head were often discarded or used for other purposes, such as fuel or the weaving of simple items. Once harvested, the stalks were transported to specialized workshops, often situated near the riverbanks. The initial stage of processing required the removal of the tough, green outer rind. This fibrous exterior, which protected the plant's core, was carefully peeled away, revealing the interior medulla. This pith was the heart of the matter, a dense, white, cellular structure saturated with water and a starchy, sugary sap. Its consistency was firm yet pliable, a matrix of vascular bundles and parenchyma tissue that held the secret to forming a durable writing surface. The next step was the most delicate. The extracted pith was sliced into thin, longitudinal strips. The skill of the craftsman was paramount here. The strips needed to be of uniform thickness, as thin as possible, without compromising their structural integrity. The finest quality papyrus, destined for sacred texts or royal documents, was made from the very center of the pith, where the cellular structure was most consistent. These strips, translucent and pale, were the fundamental building blocks of the finished sheet. The creation of a sheet, or collima, was a process of lamination, but one that ingeniously utilized the plant's own properties. A flat, moist surface, perhaps a wooden board covered with a piece of linen, served as the workbench. The freshly cut strips of pith were laid upon this surface, side by side, forming a single layer. Each strip slightly overlapped its neighbor, creating a seamless plane. The natural moisture content of the pith and the wetness of the underlying board were crucial, allowing the strips to settle and begin to adhere. This first layer was typically arranged with the plant fibers oriented vertically. Immediately, a second layer was laid on top of the first, but this time, the strips were oriented perpendicularly, in a horizontal direction. This cross-graining was the key to the sheet's strength and durability, creating a structure akin to modern plywood. The resulting lattice, a grid of vertical and horizontal plant fibers, would resist tearing and provide a stable surface for the scribe's pen. The ambition of the Ptolemaic dynasty was not merely to rule a kingdom, but to possess the entirety of human understanding. The great Library of Alexandria was the physical manifestation of this desire, a monumental repository intended to house not a selection of the world's knowledge, but all of it. This endeavor, breathtaking in its scope, necessitated a policy of acquisition that was equally relentless, systematic, and unprecedented. The library's appetite was, in a word, voracious. It was an institutional hunger for text, driven by royal decree and funded by the vast wealth of Egypt. This chapter concerns the complex and often aggressive mechanisms by which this collection was amassed, the logistical arteries through which the lifeblood of knowledge flowed into the heart of the Malsion. The foundation of the acquisition program was, of course, the royal purse. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, allocated enormous sums from the state treasury for the specific purpose of purchasing books. This was not a passive reception of offered texts, but an active, outbound pursuit. The library employed a network of agents, scholars, and merchants tasked with scouring the known world for written works. These individuals traveled to the great cultural centers of the Hellenistic sphere and beyond. Their primary destinations were the established book markets of Athens and Rhodes, cities with long traditions of literacy, philosophy, and dramatic arts. Here they would compete with private collectors and other institutions, but with the distinct advantage of a nearly inexhaustible budget. The instructions given to these agents were remarkably comprehensive. They were to acquire not only the well-known works of famous authors, the tragedies of Sophocles or the dialogues of Plato, but everything. They sought out obscure commentaries, variant editions of the same work, philosophical treatises from minor schools, collections of regional laws, poetry, medical texts, and historical annals. The goal was totality. If multiple versions of Homer's Iliad existed, the library sought to possess them all, so that its resident scholars could later compare, collate, and establish a canonical text. This created a secondary market for forgeries and texts of dubious provenance, a challenge the library's agents had to navigate with scholarly acumen. They would assess the age of the papyrus, the style of the script, and the internal consistency of the text to ascertain its authenticity before committing royal funds. The sheer volume of purchasing from Alexandria profoundly influenced the Mediterranean book trade, driving up prices and stimulating the production of copies throughout the region. However, purchase was only one facet of this multi-pronged strategy. A particularly assertive and indeed famous component of this acquisition strategy was a decree, likely instituted under Ptolemy III, which mandated that any vessel docking in the great harbor of Alexandria was subject to inspection not for contraband goods, but for scrolls. Officials, acting under the authority of the library itself, were empowered to board these ships and systematically search for any written texts. Any scrolls held within the private collections of merchants, diplomats, or simple travelers. The logistical process for this policy was methodical. Upon discovery, the scrolls were not permanently confiscated in a crude act of seizure. Instead, they were taken to the library's Scriptorium, a vast workshop filled with highly trained scribes. Here, the original scroll would be meticulously copied onto new, high-grade papyrus. The scribes of the library were masters of their craft, capable of replicating various scripts with high fidelity. The quality of the ink, the preparation of the papyrus sheets, and the precision of the calligraphy were all of the highest standard. Once the copy was completed and verified for accuracy, this new scroll was returned to its original owner. We now turn from the grand halls and the celebrated scholars, from the echoes of debate and the rustle of papyrus in the peripetoi, to a quieter, more fundamental space. We move beyond the public face of the Moussion and the Library of Alexandria into the very heart of its operations. This is the Scriptorium, the workshop where knowledge was not merely stored, but actively preserved, duplicated, and given its enduring physical form. Here, in the steady, controlled light, labored the unseen hands of the library, the anonymous artisans whose meticulous work formed the bedrock upon which the entire intellectual enterprise rested. The Scriptorium was not a place of dramatic discovery, but of painstaking replication. It was a room governed by silence, patience, and an unwavering dedication to accuracy. The air within would have been still, carrying the faint, dry scent of papyrus, the slightly acrid aroma of iron gall ink, and the subtle sweetness of gum arabic. The primary sound was not the human voice, but the rhythmic, whispering scratch of reed upon vegetable fiber, a sound repeated thousands of times a day, a quiet symphony of preservation. The architecture of the space was dictated by function. Unlike the public reading rooms, which may have been adorned with busts and mosaics, the Scriptorium was utilitarian. The most critical element was the light. To protect the delicate scrolls from the harsh, bleaching glare of the Egyptian sun, the windows were likely positioned high on the walls and oriented to the north. This provided a consistent, indirect illumination throughout the day, preventing the casting of sharp shadows that could obscure the fine lines of a character or strain the scribe's eyes. The light would have moved slowly across the plastered walls, a silent clock marking the passage of the long working hours. The scribes themselves sat not at grand tables, but at individual workstations. These were often simple, sloping desks, known as a pluteus or scrinium, designed to hold a scroll at a comfortable angle for writing. The scribe would be seated on a low, backless stool, a posture that encouraged focus, leaning forward into their work. Before each scribe lay the essential tools of their trade, a collection of objects that were extensions of their hands and their will. First and most vital was the kalamos, the writing reed. Sourced from the banks of the Nile, the common reed, Phragmites aegyptiaca, was harvested and dried. The scribe would then personally fashion their own pen. Using a small, sharp knife, they would cut one end to a point, and then carefully slice a thin slit down the center of the nib. This slit was the secret to its function, allowing ink to be drawn down from a small reservoir within the reed's hollow shaft to the tip through capillary action. The width and flexibility of the nib determined the character of the script. A broader cut produced a heavier, more formal bookhand, while a finer point was suitable for smaller, more compact writing. The maintenance of this simple tool was constant. The point would wear down with use and require frequent resharpening, a small, precise act of renewal performed countless times. Next was the ink, the atramentum. The most common type used in the Alexandrian Scriptorium was a carbon-based ink. It was made from soot, collected from lamps, which was then mixed with a binder, typically gum arabic, a resin from the acacia tree. This mixture was then diluted with water to the proper consistency. The result was a deep, permanent black ink that sat upon the surface of the papyrus. Its primary advantage was its stability. It did not fade and was resistant to water. Its disadvantage was that it could be smudged before it dried and, if necessary, could be washed or scraped away from the papyrus surface by a diligent corrector. A sponge and clean water were always kept at hand for this very purpose. The scribe's workstation also held other, more subtle tools. The ambition of the Ptolemaic dynasty was not merely to possess knowledge, but to centralize it, to create a reservoir of human thought so vast that it would become the intellectual heart of the known world. This ambition manifested itself not in quiet, ordered shelves, but in a relentless, chaotic deluge of physical objects. Before the great Pinakes of Callimachus could impose a semblance of order, there was the foundational, overwhelming reality of collection. This was the era of the great ingathering, a process that created not a library in the modern sense, but a mountain of scrolls. Imagine the port of Alexandria, the great Pharaoh's lighthouse, casting its beam over the wine-dark sea. Ships arrived daily, not just from the Hellenic world of Athens, Rhodes, and Pergamon, but from Phoenicia, from Judea, from the coasts of Italy and North Africa. They carry grain, wine, timber, and textiles, and by royal decree, they carry scrolls. The law was simple and absolute. Any vessel docking in Alexandria was subject to search. Any written work found aboard was to be confiscated. This was not theft in the eyes of the state. It was acquisition for the universal good, as defined by the king. The original scrolls were taken to the bibliothèque, while a swift copy, produced by a bank of scribes, was returned to the owner. This policy alone ensured a constant, unpredictable stream of material. This stream was augmented by royal agents, men of learning and commerce dispatched with Ptolemaic gold to the great book markets of the Mediterranean. They were tasked with acquiring everything, not just the masterworks of Homer, Plato, or the great tragedians, but everything. Histories, treatises on mathematics, obscure philosophical tracts, medical texts, collections of poetry, manuals on agriculture, astronomical charts, and even religious scriptures. There was no filter at the point of purchase. The guiding principle was totality. If it was written, it belonged in Alexandria. The result of this policy was a daily logistical challenge of immense proportions. The scrolls arrived at the libraries receiving annexes, not as individual, treasured artifacts, but as bulk cargo. They came in wooden crates, sealed with pitch against the sea salt. They were bundled in rough burlap sacks or packed in large ceramic amphorae cushioned with straw. The first sensory experience for the junior librarian, or the scribe's assistant, was not the intellectual weight of history, but the physical reality of freight. The smell of the papyrus, a dry, faintly sweet scent, was mixed with the dust of distant lands, the lingering aroma of the ship's hold, and often the unwelcome dampness of the sea. The process of uncrating was the first stage of triage. A crate might contain a meticulously prepared set of Aristotle's works from a respected Athenian school, each scroll tightly rolled, tied with a clean linen ribbon, and fitted with an identifying tag, a syllabus, of bone or ivory. But the very next crate might hold a jumble of scrolls from a provincial merchant's ship, a cheap copy of Euripides, its edges frayed, a ship's manifest and a record of accounts, a handful of personal letters, and a badly damaged scroll of poetry, its outer layers fused together by moisture into a brittle, inseparable mass. Each scroll, each volumen, was a fragile ecosystem. The papyrus itself, made from the pith of the Cyperus papyrus reed, was a miracle of ancient technology, yet profoundly vulnerable. Its layered sheets, or collimata, were glued together with a flour-based paste, an inviting meal for insects and silverfish. The journey by sea was its greatest trial. A leaking crate could introduce humidity, which would cause the papyrus to swell and the ink to run. Mildew could bloom across the surface in dark, creeping patches, obscuring the text and weakening the fibers. In the quiet, dust-moated corridors of the great Mauseon, under the persistent, yet gentle Alexandrian sun, a problem of immense and unprecedented scale was taking shape. It was not a problem of acquisition, for the Ptolemaic patrons were voracious in their gathering of the world's knowledge. The ships that docked in the harbor were compelled to surrender their books for copying, and royal agents scoured the Mediterranean for scrolls of every description. Nor was it a problem of preservation, for the dry climate and the dedicated work of the library's staff provided a stay against the relentless decay of papyrus. The problem was one of sheer mass. The library was not a collection. It was becoming a deluge, a chaotic accretion of written thought, where the wisdom of an entire civilization risked being lost within its own overwhelming volume. A scroll of Sophocles might lie indistinguishable beside a minor poet's lesser work, a treatise on medicine next to a garbled copy of a history. To find a specific text was an act of hope, not of method. The institution, intended as a beacon of organized intellect, was threatening to collapse into an unknowable archive. Into this burgeoning chaos stepped a scholar from the Greek colony of Cyrene, a man named Callimachus. He was not, it is important to note, a head librarian in the formal succession of that title. He was a poet of considerable renown, a critic, a grammarian, a man of letters whose own prodigious output was a testament to his intellectual stamina. Yet his most enduring contribution, the work that would echo through the history of information science for millennia, was not a poem or a play, but a system. He was tasked with a project of seemingly impossible scope, to map the intellectual continent that the library had become, to give it order, structure, and most importantly, accessibility. He was to be the architect of the catalog. The challenge he faced must be understood in its physical and intellectual particulars. A modern library user thinks of a book as a self-contained, clearly labeled object. It has a spine with a title and an author, a title page, a predictable internal structure. The Alexandrian scroll had none of these conveniences. It was a fragile roll of papyrus, often of considerable length, which had to be carefully unrolled with two hands. There was no spine. The title, if it existed at all, was often written on a small tag of papyrus, called a syllabus, which was attached to the outside of the scroll and was easily detached or damaged. More often, the title was simply inscribed on the inside, at the very end of the text, requiring the reader to unroll the entire document to identify it. Furthermore, the very concept of a stable title was fluid. Many works were known by different names in different places, or were simply identified by their opening words, their incipit. Authorship itself was a recurring problem. Was this tragedy truly by Euripides, or was it a later work attributed to him to increase its value? Scribes might copy multiple, unrelated works onto a single long scroll to save material, with no clear demarcation between them. A single papyrus roll could be an anthology, a miscellany, a repository of fragments. How could one possibly inventory such a collection, let alone create a functional guide to its contents? Callimachus' solution was a work as monumental as the collection it described. It was called the Pinakes, a title often translated as the Tables. Its full, formal name, as attested by later sources like the Suda lexicon, reveals its profound ambition: tables of those who were eminent in every branch of learning and of the works they composed. This was not to be a mere shelf list, a simple inventory of holdings. It was conceived as a comprehensive, critical, biobibliographical guide to the entire corpus of Greek literature and learning. It was a catalog that was, in itself, a work of profound scholarship. In the vast, sun-drenched halls of the Mauseion, the intellectual heart of Hellenistic Alexandria, a problem of unprecedented scale was taking shape. It was not a problem of acquisition, for the Ptolemaic patrons were voracious in their pursuit of knowledge, their agents scouring the Mediterranean for every written word. Nor was it a problem of preservation, for the dry Egyptian air and the meticulous care of the library's attendants were well suited to the fragile life of papyrus. The problem was one of order. It was the fundamental crisis of information overload, born from the library's very success. With a collection swelling towards 500,000 scrolls, the Great Library was in danger of becoming a labyrinth, a chaotic monument to knowledge rather than a functional repository. To possess a scroll was one thing. To find it, to understand its context, to know its place within the vast tapestry of human thought, was another entirely. The scholar tasked with confronting this intellectual chaos was Callimachus of Cyrene, a poet and critic of formidable intellect, though he never held the title of head librarian. It was under the patronage of Ptolemy II Philadelphus that Callimachus embarked upon a project of such ambition and foundational importance that its echoes resonate today in every library, both physical and digital. This project was the Pinakes. The term itself, Pinakes, is the plural of the Greek word Pinakes, meaning a tablet, a list, or a register. But the work Callimachus created was no mere inventory. It was a bibliographical and critical masterpiece, a map of the entire landscape of Greek literature and learning. It was, in effect, the world's first comprehensive library catalog. To appreciate the magnitude of this achievement, one must first visualize the physical reality of the collection. A papyrus scroll, or biblos, possessed no spine upon which a title could be neatly inscribed. When rolled and stored, often in a cylindrical container called a capsa, it was largely anonymous. A small, dangling tag of parchment or papyrus, known as a syllabos or pitakion, might bear the author's name and a title, but these were often brief, inconsistent, and easily detached. Imagine searching for a specific work by Aeschylus among tens of thousands of similar-looking scrolls, each needing to be partially unrolled for positive identification. The task was not merely inconvenient, it was functionally impossible on a large scale. The library was a universe of texts, and without a key, it was a universe without constellations, without navigational charts. Callimachus' solution was not simply to list the items. His approach was systematic, analytical, and profoundly scholarly. The Pinakes was not a single book, but a monumental work in its own right, said to have comprised 120 separate books or scrolls. It was a library about the library. Its foundational principle was division and classification. Callimachus first organized the vast literary output of the Greek world into broad categories, creating a taxonomic framework that was both logical and comprehensive for its time. Surviving fragments and later summaries from authors like Athenaeus allow us to reconstruct this grand intellectual architecture. The primary divisions were based on genre and subject matter. There were, for instance, the great divisions of poetry and prose. Within these, further subdivisions were established. Poetry was sectioned into categories such as epic, elegiac, iambic, and lyric, as well as a significant section for dramatic poetry, which was itself further divided into tragedy and comedy. The prose section was equally granular, with major headings for history, oratory, philosophy, medicine, and law. A final, capacious category, often translated as miscellaneous, likely housed works that defied easy classification, from cookbooks to treatises on obscure technical subjects. The vast accumulation of knowledge within the Motion, the intellectual heart of Alexandria, presented a challenge not of acquisition, but of order. To possess a scroll was one matter. To locate it amidst hundreds of thousands of its fellows was another entirely. The solution was not a single, grand revelation, but a system of interlocking, pragmatic components, a physical grammar for the arrangement of thought. This chapter concerns the most fundamental elements of that grammar: the individual scroll, its external identifier, and its designated place within the library's physical architecture. We speak of the papyrus roll, its protruding ticket, the syllabus, and the shelf upon which it rested. Before a scroll could be cataloged, it first had to exist as a discrete, manageable object. The standard medium, of course, was papyrus, derived from the pith of the Cyperus papyrus plant, which grew in abundance in the nearby Nile delta. Sheets, known as collimata, were meticulously produced by laying two perpendicular layers of papyrus strips, pressing them, and allowing the natural sap to act as a bonding agent. These individual sheets were then joined edge to edge with a slight overlap, creating a long, continuous roll. The length of such a roll was variable, dictated by the extent of the text it was to contain. A short lyric poem might occupy a roll of only a few feet, whereas a single book of Homer's Iliad could require a roll extending to 30 feet or more. The text was inscribed in columns running from left to right, with the scribe unrolling a new section with his left hand as he finished a column with his right. When the text was complete, the scroll was often finished with a wooden or bone rod, the omphalos, attached to its final edge. This provided structural integrity, made rolling and unrolling more uniform, and offered a convenient handle. The beginning of the scroll, its most vulnerable part, was sometimes reinforced with a protective strip of papyrus, the protocolon, which often remained blank or carried only basic information about its production. The completed object, when rolled tightly upon itself or its omphalos, presented a uniform, cylindrical shape. Its contents were entirely hidden from view, its identity a secret held within its coiled form. To ascertain its author or title, one would be forced to unroll the first several inches, a process that, if repeated thousands of times by countless patrons and scribes, would inflict cumulative and catastrophic wear upon the fragile leading edge of every scroll in the collection. A system of external identification was not merely a convenience, it was an absolute necessity for the preservation of the collection. This system was embodied in a small yet profoundly significant artifact, the syllabus. The term itself, likely derived from the Greek, referred to a small strip of papyrus, or, in some cases, a piece of treated parchment or leather. This was, in essence, an ancient bibliographic tag. A scribe would carefully inscribe upon this tag the most essential data required for identification. At a minimum, this would include the author's name and the title of the work. For example, a syllabus might read, Sophocles, Oedipus Tyrannus. In cases where a work spanned multiple scrolls, as was common for lengthy treatises or epics, the syllabus would also include the book or roll number. Thus, one might find a tag reading, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, Book 3. Sometimes additional information was included to prevent ambiguity. The author's place of origin, or a distinguishing epithet, could be added, such as Herodotus of Halicarnassus. The first few words of the text, the incipit, might also be included if the title was not standardized or if multiple versions of a work existed. The ink used was a durable carbon-based black, and the script was typically a clear, legible uncial. Once inscribed, this small ticket was affixed to the scroll. The great repository of Alexandria was more than a passive storehouse, a silent catacomb of accumulated knowledge. It was, in its most essential function, a workshop, a vast humming scriptorium where the textual body of the Hellenistic world was not merely preserved, but actively dissected, purified, and reconstituted. This chapter concerns the architects of that reconstitution, the editors, the scholars, the grammarians known as the diorthetai, the correctors. Their quiet, relentless labor, undertaken in the cool halls of the Mauseion, would define the very substance of Western literature. This was the forging of the canon. The problem they faced was one of abundance and decay. As scrolls arrived in Alexandria, by royal decree, by confiscation from ships docking in the harbor, or by acquisition from distant book markets, a bewildering reality became apparent. No two copies of a major work were ever truly identical. A scroll of the Iliad from Athens would differ subtly, or sometimes profoundly, from one acquired in Rhodes or Sinope. Centuries of manual copying, undertaken by scribes of varying skill and attentiveness, had introduced a veritable blizzard of errors. These were not malicious alterations, for the most part, but the simple, entropic degradation of information passed from hand to hand. These errors fell into several identifiable and endlessly repeating categories. There was simple omission, known as lipographia, where a scribe's eye might skip from one similar word to another further down the line, excising an entire phrase or sentence. Its opposite was dautography, the accidental repetition of a letter, a word, or a line. There was the phenomenon of transposition, or metathesis, where the order of words or letters was scrambled. And there was the constant, pervasive issue of misreading, where a tired scribe, working in poor light, might mistake one Greek letter for another of similar shape, subtly altering a word's meaning. Beyond these mechanical slips were the more intellectual corruptions, the insertion of a marginal note, a scholium, into the main body of the text by a later unthinking copyist, the deliberate improvement of a difficult passage by a scribe who believed he understood the author's intent better than the author himself, the addition of spurious, apocryphal lines to pad out a famous scene or to resolve a perceived inconsistency. The collection at Alexandria, therefore, was not a library of books, but a library of variants, a library of textual problems. The first great task of the Alexandrian scholars, beginning with the first head librarian, Xenodotus of Ephesus, was to confront this chaos. Their goal was not to create a new synthesized version of a text. Theirs was a deeply conservative project, to strip away the accretions of centuries and, through a rigorous, almost scientific process, reconstruct the oldest, most authentic version of the text possible, the urtext, as it were. This process was known as diorthosis, or correction, and it began with the painstaking act of collation. An editor and his assistants would gather every available copy of a single work, all the scrolls of Sophocles, Oedipus Tyrannus, for instance. These would be unrolled side by side on long tables. Then, with methodical patience, they would be compared, line by line, word by word, letter by letter. Every single deviation, every diaphonia was noted. This initial stage of scholarship was a purely mechanical, yet intellectually demanding, task of data collection. It required intense focus and an encyclopedic memory for scribal habits and paleographic forms. Once the landscape of variants had been mapped, the true critical work began. The scholar had to make a judgment on each point of disagreement. Which reading was the original? Which was the error? To do this, they developed a set of guiding principles. The great institution of the Mauseion, the seat of the Muses, was more than a repository of scrolls. It was a living organism of scholarship, and its heart, the vital center that regulated the flow of knowledge, was the head librarian. This position, formerly the director of the library, was not a mere administrative appointment. It was the ultimate recognition of scholarly preeminence in the Hellenistic world, a role occupied by a succession of intellectual giants whose work would define the very methods of textual criticism, grammar, and scientific inquiry for centuries to come. These were the masters of the Mausian, and their story is one of meticulous labor, of establishing order from a chaotic influx of texts, and of creating the foundational grammar of Western scholarship upon the fragile medium of papyrus. The first individual known to have held this profound responsibility was Xenodotus of Ephesus, who assumed the role in the early 3rd century BCE under the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Xenodotus was a grammarian and a literary critic, and he was confronted with a task of monumental proportions. The library, still in its relative youth, was acquiring scrolls at an unprecedented rate from across the Greek-speaking world. These texts arrived in a multiplicity of versions, replete with scribal errors accumulated over generations of manual copying, regional variations in dialect, and unauthenticated editions. There was no standard edition, no accepted canon, no system. Xenodotus's primary contribution, therefore, was one of pioneering organization. He is credited with being the first to systematically arrange the library's literary holdings. He divided the poets into distinct categories, such as epic and lyric, tragedy and comedy, and then, in a move that was revolutionary for its time, he began to arrange the works of individual authors alphabetically. This simple act of alphabetization, a fundamental tool of modern information management, was a profound intellectual leap in the 3rd century BCE, imposing a logical and retrievable order upon a previously unwieldy mass of material. But Xenodotus's work went far deeper than simple arrangement. He was the first true textual critic of the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Confronted with countless variant scrolls of the poems, he undertook the colossal project of collation, comparing different versions to produce a more reliable, corrected edition, a process the Greeks called diorthosis. He famously divided both the Iliad and the Odyssey into 24 books each, corresponding to the 24 letters of the Greek alphabet, a structure that has been retained to this day. On the papyrus itself, he developed a nascent system of critical symbols. He would mark lines he deemed spurious or inauthentic with a simple horizontal stroke in the margin, a mark known as the obelus. This was the birth of a critical apparatus, a visual language for the scholar to communicate judgments about the text's integrity directly on the physical scroll. His work was foundational, a first attempt to strip away centuries of accretion and error to get closer to an original text. Following Xenodotus, the librarianship was held for a time by Apollonius of Rhodes. Apollonius was a different kind of scholar, perhaps more of a poet than a systematician. A student of the great poet and scholar Callimachus, Apollonius, is best remembered today not for his library administration, but for his own epic poem, the Argonautica, which recounts the myth of Jason and the Golden Fleece. His tenure highlights the dual nature of the Mausian. It was not only a place for the preservation and study of past knowledge, but also for the creation of new literary works. There is a well-documented intellectual rivalry between Apollonius and his former teacher Callimachus, a dispute which may have centered on the appropriate length and style of modern epic poetry. Welcome. We turn our attention now from the intellectual ordering of the Library of Alexandria to the fundamental, physical challenges of its existence. The scroll, the very vessel of knowledge, was a profoundly fragile object. Its survival was not a given, but a constant, attritional struggle against the elemental forces of decay and destruction. This chapter concerns itself with the three great adversaries of the papyrus roll: fire, damp, and pests. The primary medium, papyrus, is a material of organic origin. It consists of the processed and laminated pith of the Cypress papyrus plant, a reed that once flourished in the Nile Delta. The manufacturing process involves slicing the pith into thin strips, laying them in two perpendicular layers, pressing them together until the plant's own saccharine juices bonded the fibers, and then drying the resulting sheet under pressure. These sheets, or collimata, were then glued together with a starch-based paste to form a long roll. The final product was a light, flexible, and receptive surface for ink. But its organic nature, its composition of dried cellulose, rendered it extraordinarily vulnerable. It was, in essence, a highly refined form of tinder, stored in vast quantities. The first and most dramatic of the perils was fire. In a city like Alexandria, fire was an ever-present tool and a constant threat. The library itself, while constructed primarily of stone and marble, was filled with flammable materials. Shelves, or pegmata, were carved from wood, often Lebanese cedar. Furniture, reading tables, and scribal workstations were also wooden. But the greatest fuel source was the collection itself. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, each one a tightly woven spiral of desiccated plant matter, represented an immense fire load. A single stray spark could initiate a catastrophe. The sources of ignition were numerous and mundane. Illumination within the vast halls and storage chambers relied on oil lamps. These were typically simple, wheel-thrown terracotta vessels containing olive oil with a linen or papyrus wick. While relatively stable, they could be knocked over. A falling lamp would shatter, spilling burning oil onto the floor, potentially splashing onto the lower shelves where scrolls were stored. Braziers, used for heat in the cooler, damp winter months, posed another significant risk. A floating ember, carried on a draft, could easily find its way to the frayed, dry edge of a scroll. The combustion of a papyrus roll is a specific and devastating process. An initial point of ignition, perhaps on the umbilicus, the wooden rod at the scroll's end, or on the exposed outer edge, would begin not with a flame, but with a creeping, glowing smolder. A thin, acrid tendril of smoke, smelling of burning grass and something akin to scorched sugar from the residual plant saps, would be the first sign. As the smolder spread along the edge, the heat would build. The tightly packed layers of the scroll would trap this heat, and the process of pyrolysis would begin, breaking down the cellulose fibers into flammable gases. At a critical temperature, these gases would ignite, and the smolder would erupt into a quiet yellow-orange flame. The fire would then travel in two ways simultaneously. It would crawl around the circular edge of the roll, consuming layer after layer. It would also burn inwards, through the spiral. The heat would cause the outer burned layers to curl and flake away as brittle black carbon. The ink, often a simple mixture of carbon black soot and a binder like gum arabic, would sometimes remain momentarily visible on the blackened shard before it, too, crumbled to dust. A scroll burning on a shelf would act as a torch, the rising heat and flames igniting the scroll directly above it. In this way, a fire could propagate up a wall of shelving with terrifying speed, each roll becoming a discrete unit of fuel, passing the conflagration to its neighbor. Welcome. We turn our attention now from the central institution of the Malsion to its significant, and often misunderstood, counterpart, the daughter library, housed within the magnificent temple complex of the Serapeum. To understand the administrative particularities of this collection, one must first apprehend its distinct context, both physical and ideological. Unlike the Malsion, which was a secluded precinct for state-sponsored scholars, the Serapeum was situated in the old Egyptian quarter of Rakotis, a bustling, multicultural district. This placement was not incidental. It positioned the daughter library at a nexus of public life, suggesting a different mandate, a different set of administrative challenges, and a different relationship with the city's populace. The temple itself was a monumental structure, likely initiated under Ptolemy III Euergetes. It was built upon an elevated platform, approached by a grand staircase of 100 steps, a deliberate architectural choice designed to inspire awe and separate the sacred space from the prosaic world below. The complex was organized around a large, central courtyard enclosed by colonnaded porticos. Within these porticos, or in adjacent halls and chambers, the library's collection was housed. The very integration of a library into a temple precinct is a critical point. It imbued the acts of reading and scholarship with a sacred quality, but it also subjected the collection to the rhythms and regulations of a religious institution. The acquisition of scrolls for the Serapeum likely followed a different protocol from that of the Museion. While the Museion aggressively sought to acquire every known text, creating a comprehensive, canonical archive for its scholars, the Serapeum's collection is believed to have been composed primarily of duplicates, secondary copies, and perhaps more introductory or didactic works. It may have served as the repository for the scrolls famously seized from ships docking in the harbor, a practice attested by writers such as Galen. In this scenario, the original scrolls would be sent to the Museion for preservation and study, while meticulously prepared copies would be created and sent to the Serapeum, eventually to be returned to the original owners. This process alone would have generated a significant administrative workflow. Let us consider the journey of such a scroll. Upon its arrival at the Serapeum, it would first be assessed for its physical condition. The papyrus would be unrolled with extreme care by a junior scribe or an attendant trained in the handling of brittle material. Its integrity would be checked for insect damage, moisture exposure, or fraying at the edges. Any necessary repairs, such as the careful application of small patches of fresh papyrus with a flour-based paste, would be undertaken before it could enter the main workflow of cataloging. The next stage was identification and classification. The scribe assigned to this task would begin by unrolling the scroll to its end to search for a colophon, the small inscription that often contained the title, the author's name, and sometimes the name of the scribe who had copied it, and the number of lines, or stichoi. If a colophon was present, the task was simplified. If not, the scribe would need to read the opening lines, the incipit, to identify the work from memory or by cross-referencing existing catalogs or lists. This required a scribe of considerable erudition. Once the work was identified, the process of codification began. This was the core of the library's administrative system. A small rectangular tag of papyrus or parchment, known as a syllabus, would be prepared. This tag was the scroll's primary identifier. Upon it, the scribe would write, in a clear and standardized hand, several key pieces of information. First, the author's name, written in the genitive case. Second, the title of the work. The narrative of the Great Library of Alexandria often seeks a singular dramatic endpoint. A great fire, a singular act of cataclysmic destruction that consumed the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world in one spectacular moment. The historical reality, however, is far less theatrical, and perhaps more melancholic. It is not the story of a sudden death, but of a slow fade, a gradual, centuries-long process of administrative neglect, shifting cultural priorities, and the simple, inexorable decay of the physical medium of knowledge itself. This was not a single event, but a systemic decline, traceable through the subtle changes in cataloging methods, acquisition policies, and the very budgets allocated for the production of new papyrus rolls. The initial shift can be located in the transition from Ptolemaic to Roman rule in 30 BCE. Under the Ptolemies, the library and its parent institution, the Museion, were central instruments of state power and cultural prestige. They were a declaration of Hellenistic supremacy. The budget for acquisitions was seemingly limitless. Royal agents scoured the Mediterranean for texts, and a famous decree mandated that any book found on a ship docking in Alexandria's harbor was to be seized, copied by the library's scribes, with the copy returned to the owner and the original accessioned into the collection. This was an aggressive, state-sponsored program of intellectual consolidation. With the arrival of Roman authority, the library's role fundamentally changed. It was no longer the centerpiece of a royal dynasty's cultural project. Rome, now the center of the world, had its own burgeoning libraries and intellectual centers. While respected, the Library of Alexandria became a provincial asset rather than an imperial priority. The direct, lavish patronage of the Ptolemies was replaced by a more complex and often less reliable system of imperial and municipal funding. This administrative shift is the first and perhaps most critical thread in the tapestry of decline. We see evidence of this in the subtle changes to the acquisitions process. The aggressive policy of seizing texts from ships appears to have fallen into disuse. Acquisitions became more passive, reliant on donations or the purchase of specific requested works. The grand project of acquiring and translating the entirety of the world's knowledge was quietly abandoned. The focus shifted from universal collection to curation and preservation. This in itself was a noble goal, but it marked a change from an institution of dynamic growth to one of managed stasis. The famous fire during Julius Caesar's Alexandrian campaign in 48 BCE is often cited as the library's end. However, contemporary accounts, such as those by Seneca, suggest the fire was confined to warehouses near the port, which likely contained scrolls intended for export or duplicates awaiting processing, rather than the main library stacks in the Bruchion, the royal quarter. While the loss of an estimated 40,000 scrolls was a significant blow, it was not a fatal one. It was, however, symptomatic of the new reality. The library was now located in a city that had become a battleground for Roman civil wars, its physical security no longer guaranteed. The subsequent centuries of the Pax Romana provided a degree of stability, but the slow erosion continued. The administrative records, were they to have survived, would likely show a steady decrease in the annual budget for the Scriptorium. This budget was the lifeblood of the institution. Papyrus is a fragile medium. In the humid climate of the Nile Delta, a scroll was susceptible to mold, insects, and simple embrittlement from repeated rolling and unrolling. The standard practice for preservation was not restoration, but transcription. A team of scribes would be constantly at work, recopying aging, fragile, or damaged scrolls onto new rolls of papyrus. The physical manifestation of an institution, its walls of marble and shelves of cedar, is ultimately subject to the immutable laws of decay and dissolution. Stone crumbles, papyrus turns to dust, and the corporeal form returns to the elements from which it was crafted. But the essence of the great Library of Alexandria was never truly confined to its physical structure. Its most profound and lasting contribution was not the collection of scrolls itself, but the systems of thought, the methodologies, and the intellectual paradigm it created and disseminated. This, its incorporeal legacy, proved far more resilient than any building. It did not burn, nor was it scattered by the winds of conquest. Instead, it permeated the intellectual currents of subsequent civilizations, an echo that continues to resonate within the very foundations of modern scholarship, information, science, and the pursuit of knowledge. The first and perhaps most fundamental echo is the concept of textual standardization. Before Alexandria, the works of poets, playwrights, and philosophers existed in a fluid state. A text like Homer's Iliad would have countless variations, differing from city-state to city-state, altered by the fallible memories of oral performers and the idiosyncratic errors of individual scribes. The scholars of the Mouseion, the research institution to which the library was attached, approached this textual chaos with a new and rigorous methodology. They were not mere custodians. They were editors, critics, and philologists. Their primary task was the creation of a definitive or canonical edition of each major work. This process was painstaking. Scribes would collate multiple versions of a single text, laying out scrolls side by side to compare them line by line, word by word. They would identify discrepancies, which could range from simple spelling variations to the omission or addition of entire passages. Each variant was noted, debated, and assessed. The librarians, men like Xenodotus of Ephesus and later Aristarchus of Samothrace, would then make scholarly judgments, a process known as emendation, to reconstruct what they believed to be the most authentic original version of the text. They developed a system of critical symbols, marginalia marked beside the text, to indicate a doubtful reading, a spurious line, or an interesting lexical point. This was the birth of textual criticism, the foundational discipline for all of the humanities. The stable, standardized texts they produced became the archetypes from which countless future copies were made, ensuring that the Homer we read today bears a direct, traceable lineage to the meticulous work performed in the halls of Alexandria 2 millennia ago. This drive for a stable, authoritative text is the very bedrock upon which literary studies, history, and philosophy are built. Flowing directly from this editorial work was an even greater organizational innovation, the birth of bibliography and systematic cataloging. As the collection swelled to hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the simple problem of retrieval became a monumental intellectual challenge. One could not simply browse. A system was required. It was the scholar-poet Callimachus of Cyrene who devised the solution, a work of unprecedented scale and conceptual brilliance known as the Pinakes, or tables. The Pinakes was not merely an inventory list. It was a comprehensive, critical, and bio-bibliographical catalog of the entire corpus of Greek literature. It is the ancestor of every library catalog, every database, every bibliography that exists today. Callimachus organized the vast collection into broad subject divisions: rhetoric, law, epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, history, medicine, mathematics, and natural science. Within these divisions, authors were listed alphabetically. For each author, Callimachus provided crucial metadata. The enduring human impulse to collect, to order, and to preserve knowledge finds one of its earliest and most profound expressions in the administration of the great Library of Alexandria. The transition from a chaotic accumulation of texts to a systematically arranged repository of thought represents a pivotal moment in our intellectual history. This process, this ancient quest for order, did not conclude with the fall of the classical world. It resonates today, its fundamental principles echoed in the silent, humming server rooms that house our digital libraries. The journey from scroll to server is not one of revolution, but of evolution, a continuous refinement of a single, monumental task: to make the world's knowledge accessible. Let us begin with the fundamental unit of the Alexandrian library, the papyrus scroll. It is a physical object, possessed of tangible qualities that dictated the entire system of its administration. A standard scroll, or biblos, was constructed from sheets of papyrus, the collimata, which were glued together to form a long strip, typically no more than 30 feet in length to remain manageable. The text was written in narrow columns, from left to right or right to left, depending on the language, with the scroll being unrolled from the left and rolled up on the right as the reader progressed. This physical reality imposed a critical limitation. Information was accessed sequentially. To find a specific passage, a scholar had to unroll a significant portion of the scroll, a laborious and time-consuming act. There was no search function, no index in the modern sense. The text was a linear stream of characters. The first challenge for the librarians, the grammarians and scholars of the Mausion, was therefore identification. A rolled scroll presents a uniform, undifferentiated exterior. Which work of Sophocles is this? Is it Oedipus Rex or Antigone? To solve this, a small tag, a strip of papyrus or parchment known as a syllabus, was attached to the exterior of the rolled scroll, hanging from the top so it would be visible when the scroll was stored. This syllabus was the primordial form of metadata. It contained the most essential information, the author's name and the title of the work. Yet, even this simple act was fraught with complexity. Authorial attribution was often uncertain. Multiple authors might share the same name. Is this the work of Aeschylus the tragedian, or another, lesser-known Aeschylus? The librarians of Alexandria thus engaged in the first systematic acts of critical scholarship, comparing textual styles, historical references, and dialectal variations to establish a canonical attribution. The syllabus might therefore include a patronymic or a geographical indicator: Aeschylus, son of Euphorion of Athens. The title, too, was not always fixed. A work might be known by several names. The The librarians had to standardize, to select one title for the catalog, while perhaps noting variants. They also engaged in stichometry, the practice of counting the lines in a work. This line count, often included on the syllabus or at the end of the text in a colophon, served a dual purpose. It assured the reader that the scroll was complete, and it provided a basis for compensating scribes, who were often paid by the line. With individual scrolls identified, the grander challenge emerged: macro-organization. How does one arrange tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of scrolls in a way that allows for efficient retrieval? This was the problem addressed by the scholar Callimachus of Cyrene in his monumental, though now lost, work, the Pinakes. The Pinakes, or tables, was not merely a list. It was a comprehensive, categorized bibliographic catalog of the library's entire holdings. It is considered the first great work of library science. Based on surviving fragments and later descriptions, we can reconstruct the probable structure of the Pinakes. Thank you for joining us on the Whispered Lore. As the last scroll is cataloged and the lamps in the great library are dimmed, so too can your own thoughts be gently filed away. The work is done. The stories are safe upon their shelves. Let the quiet rustle of ancient papyrus be the sound that carries you into slumber. The whispers of history will wait until morning. Good night, and rest well.